Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. I had an episode this week planned on some offensive security research that unfortunately got pulled back. That still happens these days, so I hope to bring that to you in a later episode. But in its place, I'm going to show you an interview I did with Bob Ackerman of AllegisCyber and Samir Reedy of Energy Impact Partners. They're two VCs in the ICS security space, and I interviewed them as part of the Hack the Capitol event last year in September. Hack the Capitol is put on by the ICS Village, the R Street Institute, and the Wilson Institute. Now, these guys are both VCs, very active in this space. They have feelings of what these companies are going to be worth today, what the future market is going to look like. And we also spend some time focusing on DC because this is Hack the Capitol. It's a government event. So we talk a little bit about what government can and can't do to help with this and what they should and shouldn't be doing to help with this. So please enjoy the show. I just want to let you know at the end, we do our first listener question. It's a question that we received back from the CCE episode. And then next week, we'll be back to fresh content, and that will be myself and Brian Owen. Two-part question. Are there any home runs out there in the ICS security space? And secondly, will there be a winner that will remain just an ICS security company? Is that a large enough segment?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's first of all, let me echo Samir's observations. A couple different points here. When we talk about 20 to 25 companies being funded in the ICS space, and isn't that a lot of activity? I will tell you, it's not a lot of activity. Vis-a-vis the size of the market opportunity, the VC community has shied away from industrial. And the VC community has a track record and a history of being very reticent to jump into industrial. The reputation is it's a large market, which makes it very attractive, slow moving, dominated by entrenched technology suppliers, none of which are innovative. It's just a set of dynamics that make it very difficult for a young, disruptive, venture-backed company to carve a toehold in a market that's reasonable. So the venture community historically has shied away from the industrial sector. And I've done a number of industrial companies over the years, and I've run at that windmill quite a few times. Our hypothesis was security was going to change that people would wake up, they would understand the security threats to that critical infrastructure, and the historic pace of innovation would no longer be acceptable. That security would change that dynamic. And I think that we have seen that, but we're still dealing with that venture capital industry legacy of not really sure about industrial. I can tell you the early days when we were, starting up Dragos and we're talking to the venture community, people go, that's a rock star team. They come from the right place. They've got great domain expertise. The market's huge, but man, it's industrial. And, industrial that's a whole different beast. So I think you look at 20 to 25 startups, and I frankly, given the size of the market opportunity, I would have expected more activity. Now, given where we're invested between Samir and myself, I'm okay with the fact that the VC community has not flooded the field with a string of undifferentiated offerings that complicate the market dynamics. But it's just industrial is just different, and it's an area that the venture community doesn't really understand. If you look at the culture of industrial, it's radically different from IT. OT engineering, OT culture, OT technology, very different from IT. Again, it's an area where the venture community doesn't have a lot of experience, and it tends to shy away from things where it doesn't have a lot of experience or there isn't a history of success. Makes it nervous and apprehension. Now, as we see some of the companies that are out there today gaining momentum, what you'll see is a pickup in venture activity, what I call the fast followers, will begin to flood in. The other dynamic you have in industrial is you don't have a history of industrial startup innovation to draw startup founders from, just because it's a byproduct of the venture community not having invested heavily in industrial in the past. So there's fewer people that are qualified to jump into industrial as startup entrepreneurs. So you got a whole really interesting set of dynamics that are at odds with the overall size of the marketplace. So it's a different way of looking at this market. Specifically to your question, Dale, we're going to build some damn big companies in this sector. This is one of the largest market opportunities out there for innovation today. There are, to Sameer's point, there are no entrenched, established, dominant security players, so it's wide open, to build those players, and we're going to see that happen. I would absolutely agree with Sameer's characterization that the M&A activity we've seen today is indicative of sort of those tertiary players, looking for a place to go and being swept up by some of the aspirants that wander into the marketplace. When you think about the landscape for industrial from a security perspective, the acquisitions today have been sort of traditional players or traditional security players that see that greenfield opportunity and looking for a toehold to expand into the OT market. That's where we've seen the activity. And a lot of it's been around asset discovery and some of the more low-hanging fruit, important fruit, but 5% of the overall solution at the end of the day. We haven't seen the big industrial players really make a move yet. I expect at some point in time they will make a move. There's going to be some challenges that maybe we'll talk about today as they try and enter into the space from a valuation perspective. But look, I think it's one of the most exciting opportunities out there. Not often do you get a market that is the size of the industrial space is measured in trillions of dollars, where security is absolutely essential. It rides on the back of the global digitization. It's exposed, and it needs to be secured. That is a big, big, big opportunity. So, I'm obviously very bullish. We continue to actively look for new opportunities in the industrial space. I think we've got a great one in our portfolio right now that is going to do some absolutely amazing things in the marketplace. But I think this market's going to be more consolidated than some of the other areas of information technology security. I think there are going to be a few big players. There's not going to be a whole lot of big players. There are going to be a few big players.
Well, we're here at Hack the Capitol, so we've got a very, let's say, a government audience and people that support the government. So why don't we talk a little bit about some issues where the government impacts some of these companies? The most obvious one is regulation. There are NERC, SIP, cybersecurity regulations on the electric sector. There aren't a tremendous amount of regulations. There's a few by name, but actually the impact has been pretty minor. How do you, we'll start with you, Sameer. How do you think the reality of regulation, such as the electric sector, or the specter of regulation, whether it be the presidential executive order or anything else, how do you think that the fact that there might be regulation coming affects these companies and the interest in the venture community in getting in? Is it a good thing, a bad thing, something else?
Yeah, that's obviously a really complicated question, but I'll say, from a couple of different perspectives. Number one, if you look at the actual asset owners, let's take utilities for example. I mean, utilities are in a really challenging position where they have so many different stakeholders to manage. They have to manage shareholders who want to maximize profit. Obviously, they have regulators, state regulators, federal regulators. They have customers. Both commercial and residential customers who want to minimize the impact on their rates, and then they have the reliability of the grid. So you have 4 or 5 different objectives, which are pretty complicated to manage, and all of those 4 or 5 constituents want different things when it comes to or have different views on how much money a utility should spend on cybersecurity. So from my perspective, one of the things that regulation can do a really good job of is unlocking a lot of funding for utilities. There's some utilities, if you're Southern Company or Xcel Energy, you're a pretty well capitalized utility, but if you're a smaller mid-market utility, a muni or a co-op that's adjacent to those utilities, they don't have the budgets. So there's a really strong opportunity for regulation to open up budget, enable these organizations, large utilities and small, to spend prudently, but make the right investments from a security perspective. So that's kind of point number one that I'll make. I think the second piece of it is, I think there are technical problems as well that the industry has sort of danced around probably for quite some time. and regulation can do a really good job of accelerating a solution to some of those technical problems. So take the executive order, NERC 13. I think those are really good examples of what we're seeing right now in this broader supply chain security renaissance that seems to be happening right now. Previously the view on supply chain security is all of these devices in the field are inherently secure, so let's manage our security programs around them. And I think right now the thing that the executive order is doing, and ultimately we're gonna have to see how that actually gets adopted to see if that's a constructive thing or not. But it's at least forcing the conversation around what are the technical solutions you actually need to implement an executive order like that. Obviously, it's not practical to go and rip out every single transformer that has components from China, but it does force the conversation around how do you actually look inside of these devices and validate the integrity of all of these devices that are going onto the grid and all of these devices that are currently onto the grid. So I think those are the two lenses that I'll look at regulation through. Number one is creating new budget, and number two, kind of forcing difficult conversations and new solutions for the innovators out there.
Interesting. Bob, I'd like you to tackle the same question, and maybe as just a twist on it, we do have, as I mentioned, one regulation that's quite detailed and causes a lot of action to take place, the NERC CIP regulations. That hasn't spawned a bunch of new companies that have grown large in size. As you answer that, is that something just because of when it came about? And if for example, we had similar regulations on oil and gas, it might be different this time?
Well, I think, first of all, timing is there's a lag. And part of what you have to, I'm going to put my glass is not, half empty, but almost empty hat on first, which is the venture perspective as it looks at anything related to government. The venture capital community's perspective is if we're dependent on government, that's a sector we don't want to be involved with. And it's not that government is not positive. It's just the government timelines and the government cycles tend to extend outside of a traditional venture funding cycle. So anything where you have a startup activity that's dependent on government activity, it tends to suffer in comparison with other opportunities. So, if you look at the venture community saying, well, government's going to do all these things and it's going to revolutionize or transition an industry, people are going to look at that with a fair amount of skepticism just because of the timing involved. Remember, the venture ecosystem operates off 18 to 24 month cycles. And so companies basically need to show significant progress within an 18 to 24 month timeline in order to support their next round of financing. Well, when you get to government, things happen over much longer timelines. And so there's a incongruity between those two timelines that tend to make the venture community skeptical of government impact on a venture-backed company. I'm going to flip that and say, in reality, when it comes to security, it's an area where government activity in terms of mandating security actually has a shaping function in the marketplace that forces capital to be allocated towards purchasing security solution. That is a net positive, a significant net positive, but there's going to be that lag. So I think that when you see, the executive order, you see some of the other regulations coming along, it will have the impact of forcing industry to increase spend, in cybersecurity solutions, and that will be a net positive from the venture community's perspective in terms of why do we invest in these types of companies. We know there's a customer out there, we know they have budget, we know they have a requirement to deploy budget to increase their security posture. That's a net positive. If you go back to 6 or 7 years ago, when the SEC put a rule in place that forced companies to disclose cyber breaches if they were material, that had a big forcing function on how industry responded to cybersecurity. For many years, if there was a cybersecurity breach, it would be, it wasn't material. And it would kind of get swept under the carpet. That SEC rule forced companies to publicly disclose when there was a cyber breach. Now you got the usual arguments about what's the meaning of material, but it was transformative in the industry. And I think the regulations that are coming out today are going to have the same impact of basically encouraging the innovation ecosystem to deploy more capital to building solutions to secure this infrastructure. And let's be honest, if we are going to secure this infrastructure, those solutions are going to come from the innovation economy. They're going to come up from the startup community, and so we have a vested interest in the venture community and the startup community developing confidence that this market is developing, that there will be capital available to procure solutions as they become available. If we can't instill that confidence and we can't unleash that creative, capability around innovation, we are going to be at a significant competitive disadvantage.
Wow, there's a lot there. Samir, I want to give you a chance because I think this is maybe the most important question we're going to tackle. But Bob, you mentioned the SEC, and I'll just tell you that I've always thought that is potentially maybe where the biggest impact would be on getting privately owned critical infrastructure to do something, because that's something that the board and the executives know they're signing up for. And if they are starting to have to not just disclose breaches, but maybe even disclose whether their systems have a certain security rating, let's say it could drive cyber insurance, it could drive a lot of things as the SEC requires things. We've seen that in other areas. The downside is it tends to just get these boilerplate answers where everything is a risk, and you get some language in there that doesn't do much. Samir, I saw you listening to Bob. I want to give you a chance to respond to anything he said or add on to it.
Yeah, no, I think it's spot on a couple of fronts. I mean, one interesting anecdote I would say is from the CEOs and boards we talk to, they have no idea who their SIM provider is or who their EDR provider is. But when it comes to their ICS detection security solution, there's a lot of awareness. I mean, those companies are pitching to the boards of directors, the CEOs. It's getting that level of awareness because it's an incredibly strategic decision what vendor and what path they go down. So, and to the points that Bob made, I think there is C-suite liability at stake here. There's board level liability at stake for the first time ever. So that's that. Anytime you have those sort of dynamics from the top down, it's driving meaningful budget. So unquestionably, yes. And then the other piece I'll mention is the business benefits. It's sort of like the business benefits of cloud. It's kind of a no-brainer for many of these organizations to accelerate from on-prem to the cloud. Same is true for what's happening in Industry 4.0, where it's starting to make more and more sense for these organizations to digitize their legacy infrastructure. Like I know remote access is something a lot of people talk about. So it's really important for regulation to keep up with that, because the business folks are always going to want to do what's in the best interest for the business. And I think it's really critical for security regulation to keep up with some of those technologies.
Another area where the government's spending money, Bob, is, and an increasing amount, DHS's cyber group, CISA, their budget seems to be going up all the time. And one of the areas where they're spending money in the ICS world is essentially competing with private industry. So they are doing assessments, they are doing incident response. They're not selling product, but they're out there selling a lot of services. Not at the scale that could actually cover the entire company, but enough that could I guess, hurt a private company. Is that government spending of money competing against private industry a good thing, a bad thing, something in the middle? How do you look at that?
Well, I would say that long term it's not sustainable. I mean, you've got to be careful, right? I think government stepping in to catalyze markets again is a useful thing. If that catalyzation goes towards building expertise, which helps inform regulatory frameworks, I think that's a helpful, probably a necessary exercise. To the extent that it competes with industry, and the industry as a result says, or what I'll call the innovation economy says, well, I'm not going there because government's there and there's no opportunity. You're going to actually stifle innovation long term. So I think government catalyzing things to get the ball rolling is a good and positive thing. I think likewise, government needs to know when to step back and let industry take the leadership role, because it will accelerate if industry takes the leadership role. So I think, if you're in government, you need to be very thoughtful about why am I doing it, and for how long do I do it, and when do I hand it over to industry? Because industry, again, will be faster and will be more efficient. And in cybersecurity, there are no rewards for second best or second place. You're either world class or you're out of the game. And so you've got to figure out, how do you position industry to drive the innovation so that you've got world-class capabilities.
What gives you some feeling that there's actually going to be some multiple billion-dollar companies that are going to be in this space, Samir?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me say two things. One, we're in the second inning of industrial security right now.
Yeah.
If we
Okay.
look at the attack surface 3 years ago versus now, it's considerably different. I think Dragos is tracking something like 12 or 13 adversarial groups today versus probably 1 or 2 3 years ago. So the threat landscape's changing. IT security is becoming much more mature. So attackers are going to more vulnerable places. So I think we sort of have to follow the threats to some extent. That's sort of point number one. I think point number two, if you look at what happened in IT security, I think probably 30 years ago, people thought IT security would be 2 product categories, and then it quickly emerged into, we probably have like 50 or 60 now. So I think OT, what we're seeing in OT detection, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think this is sort of the basic block and tackling that every security organization needs to do. But I think it's going to be sort of the leading technologies that's going to uncover a lot of next generation technologies, whether it's, remote access or product security or SDN for OT. I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities once we get through that. But that evolution is not going to be a 2-week evolution. It's going to take 10, 15 years.
Okay, and Bob, you wanted to jump in there. I could see.
Yeah. Look, I totally agree with Samir. I think calling it the second inning is probably being optimistic. I think we're in the first inning. I got to say, when I was doing cybersecurity investing 20 years ago, people just thought I was paranoid. What's the big deal? And 20 years later, you got the fastest growing segment of information technology spend is cybersecurity. So there is a natural evolution. That evolution follows the learning curve, on the part of the customers. And for many years, industrial wasn't a primary target of cybersecurity. That's now changed, precisely to Samir's point. And so it's in the very early days. You've got a very steep learning curve on the part of the infrastructure operators, which you need to address. But the threat landscape, the consequences of the threat landscape, the value associated, creation or destruction with mitigating those threats is as significant and perhaps more significant than it is outside of any sector other than financial services. So all of that, if you look from a pattern recognition standpoint, says this is big, this is serious. We're in the very early days of the market coming to understand the risk and what to do about it. I've just got 20 years of history in security where I've seen this pattern before, and I said this is going to repeat one more time. And you always start off with the simple stuff, the detection, right? That's the low-hanging fruit. Those are the first companies that got started that have been exited, tend to focus on those areas. That's 5% of what this is about. Maybe it's 5% of what this is about. With respect to, we haven't seen big valuable companies yet. Again, it's very early days. I think in the near term, you'll probably see some changes on that, Dale, that you may say, okay, I see it happening. I think things that we're aware of, give us a lot of confidence that this market is developing, it is growing, people are understanding its importance, it's attracting capital. But also, if you look at, just looking at Dragos, looking at not knowing what COVID would mean for the pipeline, and what we've seen is activity that's off the hook. It's like, didn't see that coming. An acceleration of activity in the marketplace against a customer set that historically is very methodical, very deliberate, very slow moving, and it's accelerating. That's encouraging.
I want to try to get 2 quick questions in. Just the first one is a follow-up. So you both said it was early innings, second inning, even earlier than that. How many years till this market happens? Because Stuxnet was 10 years ago. So are we talking about another 10 years or 3 years? What do you think?
Well, I think you're going to see in the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see a lot of value being created. Remember, you go back and you talk about Stuxnet, but Stuxnet was largely viewed as that was an intelligence operation that really didn't affect the rest of the industry, right? It's not, the Russians going after the Ukrainians twice, some of the stuff that took place in Saudi Arabia, where all of a sudden commercial infrastructure is being compromised. really began, I think, to open up the aperture of people understanding how broad this threat landscape was and what the consequences would be.
Samir, what do you think in terms of a timeline?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think we're going to see a meaningful inflection in the next few years, but I think from that point onward, it's sort of indefinite. I think this fight and the adversary this is never gonna end. And I think just like IT security, we're going to continue to see new product categories developed and probably new problems and new threats. So I think in the next 3 years, we're going to see that inflection, but I expect to see a lot more product categories coming out of the next 10, 15 years.
I love to get your questions. You can record your question at dale-peterson.com. Just look on the right-hand side and click on record your question. Here's our first question.
Hi, Dale. This is Vytautas Butrimas from the NATO Energy Security Center of Excellence. I just listened to your excellent podcast with Mr. Bachman and Ms. Freeman about the CCE book, Sabotage. And I was taken with one of the comparisons made, cyber versus engineering controls. That somehow bothered me that they're separated. I think we should perhaps search for a better term, a control that will ensure the safety, reliability, and performance, perhaps. But that's cyber versus engineering. I'm trying to think of myself, what are they saying about cyber? What do they mean about the engineering? Somehow they should be combined together in this high-tech world where everything is computerized, automated, and digitalized, or almost there. So thank you very much for the great podcast.
Well, first, Vitos, thanks for the question. Someone needed to kick it off. I've been hoping to get these, and I hope to get a lot more of them. I guess I have a little bit of an issue with what you're saying. Sure, the company needs to look at both the cyber side and the engineering side. So if you look at it from an organizational standpoint, yes, they shouldn't be separated. You need to look at these together, and you need to say, what is the right mix of controls from a cyber and an engineering standpoint to achieve the most efficient risk reduction? So I agree with you on maybe a macro corporate-wide view. But I think this separation of cyber and engineering is very useful because it ties into the different skill sets that are required to be successful. So, for example, on the cyber side, you don't want engineers learning how to deploy and configure and maintain security equipment like firewalls, detection solutions, two-factor authentication. It's not where they've been trained to do. It would be a waste of time for them to do that. Similarly, and probably even more importantly, we don't want cybersecurity professionals trying to understand the process and how to change it to make it more resilient. So you have this issue where you have these terms tightly tied to the skill sets and the professions that perform them. Now, this is not to say that, let's say, the security professional doesn't need to talk to the engineer, because they need to understand the actual consequence reduction that will be achieved by the security control. And similarly, the engineer needs to understand from the security professional what is possible from a cyber attacker, what they could do to the system. For example, I see a lot of engineers say, oh, that can't happen. We have soft interlocks in our PLCs to prevent that from happening. The cybersecurity professional will tell them, well, if I'm in your system, I can reprogram those so they're no longer effective. So there does need to be this cross-pollination, but I think the terminology of security controls and engineering controls that they talk about in the CCE, and quite frankly, I've adopted, is worthwhile. Because remember, at the end of the day, this is about communication. And we want to pick something that makes the people that need to be part of this conversation understand each other. I understand what you're saying, that we could probably come up with more precise terms, but our goal isn't necessarily precision, it's effective communication. So I'm a proponent of keeping those terms in that terminology. But I do appreciate your question and understand you may have a conflicting view on that. As always, please send your questions in. Record them at dale-peterson.com or email them to s4@digitalbond.com. And I'll talk to you next time. something warrants an unsolicited response.